name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News. Coming up on the political correction, we're talking about the leadership race with less than 2 weeks to go, the Felixstowe port strike, A-level results and GCSE results, and much more. But first, here are your headlines with Tatiana.
Good morning. It is 10 o'clock. I'm Tatiana Sanchez in the GB newsroom. For the first time in 3 decades, dock workers at Britain's busiest port have gone on strike in a dispute over pay. Nearly 2,000 union members at Felixstowe in Suffolk are walking out for 8 days. The port handles nearly half of all container freight that travels into Britain. Union workers recently rejected a 7% pay offer from their companies because they say it's too far below the rate of inflation. Well, Head of Corporate Affairs at the Port of Felixstowe, Paul Davey, says the strikes will prove costly for workers.
Unite, though, have declined. They refused to put the offer we've made to their members, their 1,900 members. They've had no say in this, and now they're having to go on strike. And that's going to cost each of them, you know, the thick end of sort of 900, £900 each in lost wages.
Barristers are voting on plans for an all-out strike next month in a row with the government over jobs and pay. Members of the Criminal Bar Association have already been walking out on alternative weeks in England and in Wales. They're now deciding on whether to take uninterrupted industrial action that would start on September 5th. The ballot closes at midnight today, with the result expected tomorrow. Liz Truss says there's too much talk that there's going to be a recession. In an interview with The Sun on Sunday, the Foreign Secretary is insisting that an economic slump is not inevitable, despite warnings from the Bank of England. The central bank cautions the UK could face the largest recession since the 2008 financial crisis due to the rising energy prices. If she becomes Prime Minister, Ms Truss plans to introduce immediate tax cuts, which she believes will spur growth of the economy. She's also promising a small business and self-employed revolution. Scotland Yard is being investigated by the police watchdog after it emerged officers came into contact with the student nurse Owami Davies after she was reported missing. The Met says they were called to an address in Croydon on July 6th due to concerns over a woman's welfare, but she told them she didn't want any help and they left. The interaction occurred before Essex Police handed the missing person case over to the Met on July 23rd. Ukrainian boxer Alexander Usyk has retained his heavyweight titles over Anthony Joshua in their rematch last night. The Brit was beaten on points in a split decision by judges. Following the loss, Joshua reacted angrily by tossing 2 of Usyk's belts out of the ring before shaking his hand and addressing the crowd with an emotional speech. Well, Joshua later praised the Ukrainian during a news conference.
I've got to give the man his credit because he's done well. It takes a lot to come up in weight, challenge, win the belt, defend the belt. He's good. He's really, really good. He's been doing it since a young age, had hundreds of amateur fights. He's a real deal. So well done to him. I'm happy for him.
This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to the political correction.
Good morning, you're watching and listening to GB News. This is the Political Correction and I'm Arlene Foster. Today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Embry and by the Labour MP Barry Gardner. We're here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and to put you, the people, back in charge. It's not about journalists talking to journalists, it's about you telling us what you think. So coming up this hour, with less than 2 weeks to go in the leadership race, we'll be discussing the biggest developments from the week and looking back at the GB News exclusive hustings, which took place in Manchester on Friday night. We will be joined by the chairman of the Campaign for Real Education after he said he expected record appeals for both A-levels and GCSE results. And the summer of discontent continues, with dock workers at the UK's largest container port going on strike for the first time in 30 years. But as ever, here on the Political Correction, we want to hear from you. So if you want to get involved in the conversation and have your email read out on the show, then email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at GBNews. This is the Political Correction. So let's start off, as we have been for quite some time now, by talking about a poll released this week which shows that Liz Truss is set to win the Tory leadership race by a decisive margin, suggesting 66% of members will vote for Ms Truss, with only 34% backing the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak. Going to start here with Paul here. Is it game over for Rishi?
I think it probably is. I think the writing's on the wall. The only thing I can think, Arlene, that would sabotage Liz Truss's chance of winning the leadership now were if she decided to get drunk and drive to Grantham and to vandalise the statue of Margaret Thatcher in the wee small hours of the morning. That might turn the Tory membership against her. But anything short of that, anything short of a very serious misstep, then I think she's probably got it sewn up. I mean, I know Rishi Sunak has pointed to the fact, not without reason, that British politics has seen a lot of surprises over recent years. We saw Brexit, we saw the 2017 election when Labour did much better than we were expecting. We saw the 2019 election when Labour was wiped out. And he's kind of saying, you know, these shocks can happen from time to time, which is true. But it's very, very difficult to see how he is going to surpass Liz Truss at this stage. So I suspect it is all over. The only thing I would say, the contest is far too long. I mean, it's interminable now. I think it should have been sorted well before now. I suspect much of the country is getting a bit tired of it. I suspect some Tory members are probably getting a bit tired of it as well. Yeah,
it has been a very long, drawn-out contest, but I think it's probably because, Barry, we're in the summer months, not much else is happening, and so all of the attention's on the Tory leadership.
Well, indeed it is. And look, for me, I'm a Labour politician. This is the choice between somebody who says he's got no working-class friends and the other one who says that people up north are lazy. It's a choice between cholera and chlamydia, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, my goodness.
You know,
I'm not sure we'd say that.
Not quite fair.
Lovely image on a Sunday morning.
Not quite fair. You know, with chlamydia, you might have had some fun contracting it. But,
my goodness.
No, look, you're not going to get me to vote for either of them.
Well, I didn't expect you were a Tory member now, Barry, to be fair.
They wouldn't let me. And but I think people in the country are looking at this and they're saying, why is it, on a serious point, why is it that 50,000 Conservative Party activists have got the right to choose our future Prime Minister?
Well, because we're in a party system, of course.
Well, indeed.
That's what we are.
But you know, it's one thing when somebody goes through a general election and the public decide which party is going to do that. But they do that in the knowledge of who is going to become the Prime Minister from that party. So I do think people are thinking, you know, this isn't exactly fair. And it's, what, the third time it's happened, I think, now? So I don't think it's right. And I think also people are saying, you know, all the things they're talking about are appealing to a very tiny selection of the population, and they're not addressing the really big issues that the public feel they should be addressing. And that's, I think, you know, Paul's right to say it's gone on too long. You know, maybe the Conservative government wanted it to go on long because, you know, no publicity is bad publicity. And it's good to keep your name in the frame there.
Well, and certainly at the beginning of the contest, there was a poll that said that people didn't recognise the people that were coming forward to be the next leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister. So I don't think people will say that now after this Conservative contest, because Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak have been on our screens every day.
Yeah. And that in itself, you know, is biasing public perception. I mean, you know, it's not equal airtime. You know, the BBC is supposed to have an equality here. And you can't have that equality when constantly it's a debate between those two within the Conservative Party. But I think the most important issue is the democratic deficit and the sense that people have of, you know, stop talking to yourselves, start talking to us, the public, about things that we want you to talk about.
And some people have raised the argument that because it is so interminable, number one, and because it's being limited to the membership in terms of the vote, the membership of the Tory party, is there an argument to say, really, it should just be the MPs who decide who the leader is? A, you would, in that situation, get it done more quickly, and B, and I'm not saying I support this argument, by the way, but I think at least it's a credible argument. Look, MPs are subject to their constituents, to the wider country, in a way that ordinary activist party members are not. Now, I know in years gone by, both major parties, including obviously the Labour Party, Barry, until 1980, I think it was, just allowed MPs to decide the leader. And I think there was an argument at the time that actually you do, as a leader who's elected by your MPs, you do have more credibility, you do generally have more support within the parliamentary party than if a Corbyn situation, for example, where he was elected, didn't have the support of large parts of the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party, but massive support among the members.
Look,
that is an important debate, isn't it?
You're throwing me a curveball. I'll hit it right back to you. It seems to me that a political party is actually not the property of a tiny group of MPs. I mean, we're talking about 50,000 Conservative activists being a tiny proportion of the population deciding on who the Prime Minister is. If you say it should be the preserve of the members of Parliament, you're reducing that to an infinitesimal percentage.
Yes.
Now, my view is that a political party is about the membership. It's about the policies that the members create, and therefore it's right that they choose who they think best should lead the party. And that's why we made the change that we did. Before that, we had a college, an electoral college system, so that, you know, it was a third the Parliamentary Labour Party, a third the unions, and a third the constituency members. But I do think you've got to say, you know, MPs do not own the party. That's the wrong way of looking at it. It's the members, it's the broad...
So if I can summarise it like this then, Barry, essentially what you're saying is it's the right of the membership to choose their leader, but what you're talking about is the Prime Minister and the fact that you feel it should be the country that decides the Prime Minister. Is that essentially
yes,
it?
And that's why I think always in a situation like this, you get people saying, OK, you come in as Prime Minister in our system, now have a general election and let's see if the public believe that you're...
Do you think
that
should be the default position, Barry, that whenever a new Prime Minister takes over, immediately they should go to the country to get that mandate?
I mean...
Because Gordon Brown didn't do it.
No, indeed, and I think that's right. And in fact, I think most of us would say Gordon made a really big strategic error in not doing that straight away. He was set to do it within 3 months. He did a brilliant 3 months. He'd cope with the floods, if you remember, in 2008. And
it was a terrorist attack at Glasgow Airport.
2007, rather,
then the global financial crisis.
He did really, really well for those first few months. And we were all set for a general election. And then, of course, David Cameron did his walking around at the Conservative Party conference. And I think Gordon just got cold feet. And I think that was a real mistake, because Gordon had been on a high and then that was called off. But I think, look, the Prime Minister of the country, yeah, we don't want a presidential system, but increasingly, I think politics has become about persona. It's become about people at the top rather than a huge discussion of policy.
Well, you see, therein lies the problem.
Yeah,
therein lies the problem, because it should be about ideals and ideas. But anyway, what we're going to do now is we've been talking about them, so let's see them. On Friday night, Alistair Stewart hosted a GBNews exclusive live from Manchester, speaking directly to leadership hopefuls Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, with just 2 weeks left of the voting in the race. So later on in the show, we'll be speaking to Alistair. But first, let's take a listen to him asking both candidates about their vision for the country should they win the keys to number 10.
What is the Sunak vision of how Britain should be through Conservative eyes?
Government can't do everything, but more than that, government shouldn't do everything. We are Conservatives. We believe in personal responsibility. We believe in families. We believe in communities. And yes, COVID happened, but that is not the norm. We've got to be willing to actually just make the argument, because all the pressure is always there. And as that's what you've seen over the last 2 years, that's not me. I don't wake up every morning and when a problem comes my way think, oh, well, how can the government spend some money to solve this problem? That is wrong. That's not what a Conservative government should do, and that is not what I will do as Prime Minister.
My ambition is for the private sector to grow more than the public sector. And one of the problems I think we've got is there's been an assumption by various members of what I call the economic orthodoxy that Britain is a low-growth country, and therefore everything is static. We have to make sure that we are taxing people to keep up with public spending. That is not my vision. I believe we can get to much higher growth. I want the private sector to be bigger compared to the public sector, and I want a sustainable public sector. You know, we have far too many quangos in this country. We have 500 of them. We need to trim it down to size, and we need to make the government efficient.
I am winning the argument about tackling inflation, being responsible with our borrowing, about actually supporting vulnerable people this autumn and winter, which my plan will do, Liz's plan does not do, about actually reforming our tax system so it delivers growth.
We do need to make sure our police are policing the streets rather than policing Twitter, and focusing on the right crimes the public are concerned about. See, what I would do is have league tables that compare police forces and how they are performing, so they can really be held to account by the public.
So, Paul, that was the two candidates there. Rishi Sunak saying there's an over-reliance on government is simply wrong. What do you make of those comments?
Well, I hate the idea that government is no more than a necessary evil, which seems to be the Tory line. It seems to be Rishi Sunak's line, Liz Truss's line. And, you know, it's a traditional Tory line going back many
well,
decades.
small state, they want a small state.
Well, small state, but, you know, really that government can only cause problems and it shouldn't intervene unless it's only really, really necessary. Now, what happened in the global financial crisis when the market failed and when the banks failed? What was it? Who was it that stepped in and put right what the markets had got wrong? It was government. Yeah. What happened in the pandemic when the government... Now, you can have all sorts of arguments over whether the restrictions were ultimately necessary. I've got a particular point of view on that. But at the end of the day, who was it who provided the furlough scheme? Who was it who stepped in to make sure that people didn't go bankrupt and that people didn't lose their homes, etc.? It was government. And this kind of Thatcherite line of rolling back the frontiers of the state, handing everything over to the market knows best, the market's infallible, put your faith in market outcomes rather than in elected representatives and national governments to deliver. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe in a flourishing private sector. I think there's absolutely a role for the private sector, but let's not get bogged down in this ridiculous idea that there is no place for government. And I think if I were, and I've said on the show before, Arlene, if I were advising the Tories, I would say, look, be very careful about that narrative, because actually the people in red wall constituencies who voted for you for the first time in 2019, they don't want a return to Thatcherism. They don't want a return that says, you know, it's the survival of the fittest, get the state out of people's lives, let the market dominate, because people saw the legacy of that in the 1980s. So in crude electoral terms, I don't think this is a wise kind of narrative for the Tories to be peddling, but let them carry on peddling it.
I was just going to say, Paul, maybe you're looking for a job with the next Prime Minister. But Barry, Liz Truss said her ambition is for the private sector to grow more than the public sector. What are your thoughts on that? Because you know what the public sector is like in Northern Ireland. It's absolutely enormous. I think it's about 66%. And we have struggled in government in Northern Ireland to try and get the private sector to be more innovative, to be involved in research and development and to grow. And it's a real challenge.
Arlene, you know I was Minister in Betty in the Department of Enterprise in Northern Ireland. And I absolutely agree with you. Look, I want a strong private sector. But two things. One, you don't achieve a strong private sector by simply cutting the size of the public sector.
No, you want the private sector.
You want the private sector to grow. And I think the danger is that, you know, I don't want a stronger private sector because we're getting more private companies taking over the NHS. That's the last thing I want to see. So I think that's the first thing to say. The other is that, actually, the way you grow the private sector is by addressing the supply side constraints. You see, what Liz Truss was saying is, oh, it's all about taxation. No, it's not. It's actually about the supply side of the economy. It's about skills and the employment, the labour base that the private sector has to draw on. And what this government, with her in the cabinet, has been so bad at doing is in boosting apprenticeships, in boosting skills, in making sure that that labour force is there in order to be able to provide that dynamism into the private sector. So this is really important that the government gets this right. The other thing I would say here is that, in a sense, she's arguing against the public mood. And she needs to be, you know, if she's going to become Prime Minister, she needs to be careful about that. Because all the polls say that people are now wanting to see the rail companies renationalised, the water companies renationalised, taken back into the public sector because they feel that with sewage spilling out into the North Sea at the rate of knots, with leaks in the pipes losing, you know, billions of gallons every week, they're not confident that the private sector has been running those monopolies well. So, yes, I agree. I want a strong private sector in this country, but I want it done in the right way, with a strong labour base, with a strong skills base, with strong research and development, and for companies that can then pay their workers properly, rather than actually relying on us, the taxpayer, to top up wages through universal credit and other means.
And what's missing as well, I think, is in terms of growing the private sector, there's not enough focus, and there hasn't been in our country for a long time under governments of both colours, on the real economy, the productive sector. We've become so obsessed, I think, with our reliance on financial services.
Absolutely right.
But actually, when it comes to the real economy where goods are produced and wealth is made, we don't talk about competitiveness, we don't talk about productivity, we don't talk about investment, we don't talk about the impact of a high exchange rate and what that's done in terms of strangling our productive sector. And we've seen, I think, as a consequence of that, massive wealth inequality and income inequality in this country. We've seen, and we're seeing at the moment, you know, as part of this cost of living crisis, actually a shift of wealth in favour of the rich and away from the poor.
But I think, Paul, on the supply chain, global supply chains, I think you're going to see more attention paid now to production. And of course, we do have to move with the times and have the new economy, the technology, all of those pieces have to be built upon as well. So we can't look backwards. We do need to move forward and look at the new economy as well in terms of what we're producing in technology and artificial intelligence and all of those pieces as well. So, I mean, we're going to move on now, but we'll no doubt return to this later on in the programme. But coming up after the break, we'll be talking about the Felixstowe port strike, where dock workers have gone on strike for the first time in 30 years. And of course, we want to hear from you today, so get involved. Email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the Political Correction. Now, did you know one of Britain's biggest ports is Felixstowe? The dock handles nearly half of all goods that come into this country, and workers there will begin 8 days of strikes starting today. Now, it's expected that this walkout will impact a number of supply chains around the country as the port grinds to a halt. And this is obviously a big issue for the workers there who have not downed tools since 1989. Paul, more strikes to hit the UK. What have you got to say about it?
And they don't come out of a clear blue sky,
No.
Arlene. That's what I would say. I think it's a reflection of the fact that millions of workers have just had enough. They've had something like 14 years of financial pain, first of all as a result of the global financial crisis, now as a result of the cost of living crisis. That's had a real impact on them. They've had low wage increases for the best part of that period. And they're being told again that, you know, you are the people who have to show restraint, even though your real wages are falling year on year and your living standards are crashing. Actually, there's going to be more years of financial hardship. You have to pay the price for economic crises that were not of your making. And does anyone really think that workers are going to put their hands up and say, OK, fair enough, I'll carry on paying that price? At some point, they draw a line and they say, look, enough is enough. I'm not prepared to accept this anymore. And particularly when you factor in the fact that they, you know, as we touched on before the break, they see the fact that directors' pay seems to constantly go up. They see that city bonuses constantly seem to go up. They see profits going up, some of the big corporations making fantastically enormous profits and paying their shareholders fantastic dividends. Why don't we argue for profit restraint on the part of some of these corporations rather than arguing for wage restraint on the part of workers? And I just think there's a bit of a storm brewing in this country. And
and from the headlines we heard there, the barristers are going on strike as well. And I had an interesting conversation with someone on Friday on my show when we talked about inflation, and he was saying one of the difficulties for employers is the fact that they don't know where inflation is going to end up. So they're actually trying to assess, well, what should I be offering my workers? Because is it going to be the 2% which government's talking about, which clearly it isn't? It's now at 10.2%. Yeah, is it going to go up to 13%? What is it that employers should take as their yardstick for deciding on workers' pay? And I think that's very difficult for employers as well. I know we were talking about people in receipt of pay, but workers or employers find it difficult as well, I think, Paul, to make that assessment. Would you agree with that, Barry?
I think that's right. It's actually a really difficult time to be an employer trying to gauge what's going to be acceptable. But if it's difficult for them, hey, I know. It's a hell of a lot more difficult to be a worker and not to be able to pay your rent, not to be able to pay your mortgage, not to be able to pay your electricity and gas bills. And that's the reality that people are facing. And, you know, we're talking about a port here at Felixstowe. Well, DPP World, who were the guys who sacked 800 workers from P&O, they owned the company that sacked 800 workers over a Zoom call. Last week, they reported record profits. Now, DPP World actually own a third of the ports in the UK. I don't know if they own Felixstowe or not. But exactly what Paul's saying, these companies are making record profits. And nobody's saying, well, let's have a bit of moderation about the amount that is being siphoned into not only directors' pay, but into shareholders' pockets as a result at the other end. Because, as I say, what's happening is you and I are subsidising companies who are not paying their workers enough to even maintain their standard of living, let alone see it rise, and yet, at the same time, that money is being siphoned into shareholders' pockets.
Or going to Dubai in the case of DPP World. But we're going to move on now to look at another story which grabbed our attention. Authorities have asked for excess death figures to be examined after it was reported that the lockdown effects may be killing more people than COVID. According to the Daily Telegraph, figures from the ONS show that around 1,000 more people than usual are currently dying each week from conditions other than the virus. Barry, are we now seeing the long-term effects of lockdown?
I think we are, because what's happened in lockdown is a lot of conditions were not getting diagnosed early enough, they weren't getting treated early enough, and of course, as that happens, people are then finding out that they've got these conditions later on. The treatment is that much more expensive, it's that much more complicated, but let's be honest about this, Arlene. Yes, we now have waiting lists of 6.6, 6.7 million people on the waiting list. But even before lockdown, they were at record levels of 3.5 to 4 million on those waiting lists. And the Public Accounts Committee recently came out with a report that said that they have not met the cancer targets since 2014. We're talking 8 years back. So this is the long-term underfunding of our National Health Service during the austerity years. It was a deliberate policy. It didn't not only keep it pace with inflation, but as you know, medical inflation is much higher than normal inflation, so it certainly didn't keep pace with that, the funding that was going in.
Although if you take, and I mean, I know I use Northern Ireland as a yardstick because I know it better than elsewhere in the UK, but I mean, we're spending over 50% of our block grant now on the health service. I mean, that is incredible. There must be more to it that we need to do rather than just throw money at it, Barry. That's the point I'm making to you. There are other issues that need to be addressed as well as putting more money.
Arlene, we go back to the supply side.
Yeah.
And, you know, I know later on we'll be talking about A-level results and so on. But why is it? Why is it that we don't have enough doctors when kids with 4 A-star A-levels are being told, no, we haven't got a place for you in medical school? This is insane. We need to be making sure that we've got enough nurses, enough doctors going into the system, so we're not actually having to poach them from developing countries at their expense. And the whole push that happened about a decade ago when George Osborne came in and said, we don't need this headroom in the NHS. We can reduce the number of beds so that we get it much closer to the actual occupancy rates. So all the slack that was there in the system, which could cope with that increase, was taken away. And this is about the supply side. It is about skills and jobs.
And that's the issue you talked about, skills and jobs. Paul, what's your take on the lockdown excess deaths?
Well, I think the bill's landing to a certain degree, Arlene. I was one of those people who expressed severe reservations over the extremities of the restrictions that were imposed, the biggest restrictions on our personal liberties outside of wartime. And whilst obviously you want a compassionate society that looks after...
That is so cruel. That's so cruel.
People were frightened, effectively bullied into not going. People were effectively told, look, unless you are at death's door, do not come near this hospital because we're too busy.
And we could have set up the Nightingale as a designated. And what happened? We set it up and then it didn't do anything, and it was all deconstructed again.
Yeah.
So there were ways. I agree with you. I don't think the government.
I think we have to take learning points from what happened, and I think that's what we need to do. Anyway, coming up on the political correction, we'll be talking about GCSE and A-level results with the chairman of the Campaign for Real Education. So don't go anywhere.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the political correction, and as ever, we've got some of your views in front of us. Paul, have you some views to share?
Yeah, we've got one from Jack, who says the public sector is too large, far too many in public services who are not fit for purpose. Reduce it, we'll all save money.
Yeah, and Barry, have you a view?
I do. Tom says most of the privatised utilities and train companies are owned by foreign nationalised companies. So the argument that nationalisation doesn't work doesn't make sense, and they're already run by nationalised companies, just ones that don't put the Britain and Northern Ireland first. Absolutely right, Tom. And, you know, we need to look at this again.
And thank you, Tom, for saying Britain and Northern Ireland, which sometimes is forgotten about. Joan is saying that the EU has a lot to answer for regarding our economy. Their free movement rules has got us to use too cheap foreign labour. And no, they're not prepared to pay enough to get British workers to do the job. Paul, have you any more?
Yeah, we've got David, who says the British Constitution requires an immediate radical review, from the farcical election of a new Prime Minister to the politically disconnected MPs. It is totally unrepresentative and unaccountable to the electorate. I should say, Arlene, talking of views, actually, I noticed that you had a piece in the Sunday Telegraph this morning talking about your new campaign to promote the union. What's the detail on that?
Well, I mean, Paul, since I left party politics last year, I've been very conscious of the fact that there seems to be movements to break up the union, whether in Northern Ireland or in Scotland, and there isn't really a pushback on why the union's relevant today, what are the benefits of being in the UK. So, along with some colleagues, we've started up a foundation called Together UK. It's just in its infancy, and we're hoping to push back against those narratives about an independent Scotland or United Ireland being inevitable, which I would argue very strongly they're not inevitable. There is a need to have that conversation, and I think it shouldn't be one-sided. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Have you got Nicola Sturgeon on board?
I think Nicola won't be on board, but I think it is important. And I mean, I've been talking about this quite a lot on this programme, and as we all have, about the need for civilised debate. what is the rational, logical case for staying in the union as opposed to the sort of scenes that we've seen in Scotland at the Tory hustings, you know, with people shouting and ranting and raving at each other instead of having a conversation about why the union's important. So I hope that's what we can facilitate. But we're going to move on now to education, and specialists have warned that pupils may not have realistic expectations about their GCSE results this year, following a record decline in top grades in A-level results, which were released on Thursday. Chris McGovern, who's the chairman of the Campaign for Real Education, said he expected record appeals from both A-levels and GCSEs. And we're delighted to say that Chris joins us now to discuss this story further. Chris, thank you and welcome to the show. Why do you think there's going to be record appeals, as you have said, over this past weekend?
Well, I think basically because we've had excellent results, or they appear to be excellent results in the last 2 years at GCSE. Expectations have been very high. That's partly because teachers were very generous in the grades they awarded. And so expectations are raised, and now youngsters and their parents are expecting to get into the universities they want to get into. And if they fail to do so, then you're going to have appeals. And it's a legitimate process. Exams can be remarked. They can be upgraded or downgraded as a result of that. So expectations are very, very high as a consequence of the solution of 2 years ago. So today's problem is yesterday's solution.
And we're talking about A-levels and GCSE results, but as Barry was reminding me earlier on before we come on the show, the BTEC results had a bit of a disaster. Some people still haven't had their results yet.
Yeah, it's lamentable, really. The performance of the exam boards really isn't satisfactory, and youngsters are being let down, not for the first time. And some youngsters are still waiting, even now, to get their results. So what do they do when they want to apply for a university? And maybe they won't get quite the results they want. They want to go into what's called clearing, see what places are available. But they can't do that because they haven't got their results. So it's the examination boards, once again, letting youngsters down. And we have several exam boards, including one for Northern Ireland. And to some extent, you know, these exam boards, they compete to be easier in many ways. And the easier they are, the more candidates they get. I remember a long time ago, before Tony Blair was Prime Minister, but when he was Shadow Trade and Industry Secretary, saying to Tony Blair that the exam boards basically ran a cartel. You know, they basically closed the door on any other competition and they worked things out between themselves. Tony Blair at the time said that he agreed with me, but I'd have to prove it was against the public interest. Later, more recently, I rated with Michael Gove when he was Education Secretary. He agreed with me. It was against the public interest to have competing exam boards, not particularly well run. And I think there's a very strong case for having perhaps a single examination board, certainly across England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Maybe Scotland would be separate from that. But there's a case for that. And when I raised this issue with Tony Blair all those years ago, is because at that time, the O-level exam was phased out and a new exam, GCSE, was brought in, and the results are coming out next week for GCSE. But interestingly, we still produce the O-level exam in England, in Cambridge.
Oh, goodness. We seem to have very suddenly lost Chris there. I'm sorry about that. But when he was speaking about O-levels, it brought it all back to me in a flash there. I was the last year to sit O-levels. I have an O-level. I don't have GCSEs. So that's what happened there. I'm not saying that I destroyed the system. That would be very wrong. Anyway, we're going to move on now to talk about another story that caught our eye over the week. And women and ethnic minorities are reportedly being favoured in recruitment drives to meet impossible targets, prompting the head of recruitment at the RAF to resign in protest. Sources have said that job offers to white male recruits have effectively been paused to meet diversity targets. The head of the RAF has been accused of being willing to compromise the security of the UK to improve diversity within the force. Paul, I'm going to come to you first on this story. This is a huge story. I mean, do we care who flies our planes?
I think we care, but I don't think we obsess about the question of race and colour as some of our institutions do and some of our leaders do. And if this is true, and it seems to be, then it's simply wrong, in my view, Arlene. It's so wrong. I mean, all decent people should, of course, believe that your race, the colour of your skin, should not be an obstacle to your ability to be able to progress through life, to choose the career that you want to follow. But it seems to me that instead of taking what should be a colour-blind approach to these things, we are more and more obsessing about colour. And I think the danger then is you end up with an oversteer. And I think this is actually a manifestation of an oversteer, where people have said, for understandable reasons, look, if there are groups within our armed services, within our institutions who are underrepresented, then we need to ask ourselves the question,
why?
Are we doing enough to break down barriers? Those are legitimate questions to ask. But to say that we should pause recruitment for white men in order to meet those diversity targets is, I called it a form of reverse racism, and I was corrected by someone who said, well, no, it's actually racism as much as any other form of racism. And I think that's sad, and I think the danger is we end up in some kind of segregated society by default. So if there's truth in the story, and I think there seems to be, then it is really worrying, I think.
Yeah. And Barry, what's your take on this story?
Well, my take's different. I look at this and I say, the real story here is, why was the RAF not recruiting women and members of BAME communities in equal proportion to that which they represent in the population? They weren't. Now, if you accept that premise, that everybody in the population, whatever, whether they're a woman or whether they're from an ethnic minority background, is just as able, just as intelligent, then the question is, why were they not being recruited into the RAF in that proportion?
But the question might be a simpler question. Might be, why aren't they coming forward to be recruited?
And that's why actually positive action. And you'll rarely get me defending a Conservative MP, but James Heapy, who is the Defence Minister who was responsible in this area, he made it very clear that he wanted positive action, which is perfectly legal, and not positive discrimination, which is preferring somebody on a protected characteristic, which is illegal. So I look to the woman who is actually in the RAF, who I understand, who said in response to this story, you know what? I remember the day when the adverts for the RAF did not have a single woman in it. When actually they weren't trying to attract women into the RAF at all, and you weren't allowed to, right? When the army didn't accept women. So if we're going to look at discrimination here, let's actually get the big picture, not the small picture, because the government, I think, for once, has behaved absolutely properly in saying, when we recruit, we want to be recruiting people of colour, people, whether they're women or people of colour, we want to be recruiting them in the same proportion as they represent of the population. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that women and members of ethnic minorities are in the forefront of our recruitment process, so that people who come from ethnic minority backgrounds can look and say, oh yeah, there are people like me in the RAF. There didn't used to be, but now there are. But maybe it's a career that I can embrace and succeed in.
Yeah, but that's slightly different, because that's a case of I can't believe what I cannot see, and it's important that we say that the people are welcome, and but that's different from discrimination, isn't it?
But if you want the best talent, that's what you've got to do.
I
don't
accept
think that position, Barry, is inconsistent with what I'm saying, which is, on the one hand, examine your structures, make sure you've broken down all barriers, make sure you reach out to people, make sure you give the message that this service is a service that will welcome you regardless of your background. But when it comes to the point where you appoint people, and this is what the story is about, and this is why what I think has gone on is wrong.
But it's not, it hasn't gone on, Paul. Let's be clear.
I think it has, actually. I think there's evidence to show that there's been leaked documents which have effectively said, look, we need to front-load our squads, we need to appoint people from black and minority ethnic communities more quickly, because we've got diversity targets to reach. And that's the point at which you discriminate, because you say, look, we are going to put people on a contract, we're going to start paying them a salary, and we're doing it now because they're not white.
On a point of clarification, there has been one email which was leaked from 2020, whereby one person said, put on hold recruitment of white males.
Well, that's bad enough.
Put it on hold, right? But it's clear that that was not what was authorised. It was very clear in the instruction that came from the minister that there should not be positive discrimination, which you and I both agree is illegal and against the law, but that there should be positive action. Now, I think we're all agreed
yes.
that we want the best armed forces we can get. And we're all agreed that actually there is equal talent across our population, black, white, male, female, doesn't matter. So what we should be trying to do is to make sure that we get the very best, and for far too long, our armed forces have not enabled themselves to get the very best because they've actually discriminated, structurally discriminated against black people, but structurally discriminated against white people.
That's very true, but you don't fight explicitly.
You don't then go the other way. You don't become illegal.
I think we are going the other way, because what we're doing is we're fighting explicit racism with a kind of implicit racism, which says, look, if you're a white person, and bearing in mind, some of these white people who applied for the RAF might be white kids from disadvantaged communities living in Wigan or some post-industrial town.
Wherever they come from.
And some of the black and minority ethnic people who have been appointed might have middle-class parents living in a nice, affluent suburb of London. So actually, that doesn't...
I think it's the whole story. You can't just say on race or gender, because, look, Barry's right. I mean, I remember when I was a lawyer taking a case for a lady who, when she was pregnant, had to leave the armed forces because she was pregnant. And that used to be the case. Yes. So we have moved on from that, but you have to look at the whole societal issue and not just whether you are female, but where do you come from? What is your backstory? And actually not just say to white working class kids, you're at the bottom of the pile now.
And I think that is, I mean, we're getting, we can get into the whole concept of white privilege, which I think is a nonsense and I think is divisive because, we were talking before the show that there are millions of kids from white backgrounds, white kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, who are often the cohort who do worse in school, have the worst exam results, less likely to go to university. And the idea that you should say to anybody, look, because you're white, you have some sort of privilege, and therefore, whatever your socio-economic background, we're going to put you on the back burner and, give preference to somebody else, I think is appalling. But I do think, and I disagree with Barry, I think the evidence does point to the fact that this has happened because, a senior member of the recruitment team at the RAF has resigned.
Well, wouldn't you resign if you had been the recruitment officer who had presided over a recruitment process that had failed to recruit the best people into the armed forces, the best people into the RAF, because it wasn't actually representing the wealth of talent across the population?
I don't think that's why she resigned, though, Barry. I think she resigned, certainly the reports are that she resigned in protest, A, because the diversity targets were too stringent, and B, because she felt that the whole thing was being manipulated in order to achieve those targets, and that this is where the story of the pause on white men being appointed...
So who was doing that if she was the head of recruitment? Because it certainly wasn't a minister that was doing it.
No.
So who was...
Well, I think
she saying actually did?
I think it's because a lot of our institutions have become target-driven now, and if the target hasn't been met, whether it's diversity targets or job targets, if you're in economic investment roles, then they feel as if they've failed. If those targets aren't met.
I should say also, I've worked in the fire service for 25 years. I've served with some fantastic firefighters and officers from black and minority ethnic backgrounds and women firefighters. I've never had one of them ever approach me, and I was a senior official in the Fire Brigades Union, and say, we think we should be given some sort of special treatment. We want a leg up in some way. I think most people from those backgrounds actually look down on any tokenism that says, look, you need some sort of special help.
Can we end on a point of agreement? We all agree that tokenism is no use. We all agree that positive discrimination is illegal and should not happen. And we all agree that positive action is necessary to sort out institutions which for years have discriminated in the past against women and against black and ethnic minority candidates.
You're such a conciliator. No wonder Tony Blair put you in Northern Ireland, Barry. You're such a conciliator. How can we argue with that?
Well, I think we should agree on that point. We've had a good discussion around that. And we're coming up now to the end of the first hour. And we'll come back again in the second hour to have many more discussions. But before we do, I'm going to read out some more views, because Barry actually talked about nationalisation and how Tom really wanted to point out that privatised companies weren't doing the job. But Steve, and I think it's important we have balance on the political correction, Steve is saying, having been around in the 60s and 70s, I witnessed how badly managed the nationalised industries were. People need to be careful for what they wish for. There you are, Barry. Steve's challenging you.
Well, Steve's right. Nationalised industries didn't always perform well. But the reason they didn't, Steve, was very often because they weren't adequately funded. And governments successively said, oh, well, we can cut back here because we want to spend our money in other ways. And actually, if you are going to nationalise the industries, you've got to make sure that they are properly funded. That was the argument for privatising them. They could then raise extra private capital. So do it well. If you're going to do it. I think it's the best way. It keeps them in public ownership, it keeps them public accountable, and it makes sure that they're not siphoning off the profit into the private sector, but make sure they continue to do well, to make money, and to provide the service that they're supposed to, instead of pumping out shit into the North Sea.
Oh, lovely. Paul.
And look how much the taxpayers are subsidising the railways at the moment.
Absolutely.
I mean, people talk about, the cost of British Rail, it was ineffective and so on, it was wasteful. We're putting millions and millions and millions of pounds every year into the private railway companies. Why not nationalise them, take them back into public ownership, save that money, run a better, cheaper, cleaner, fairer service?
My goodness, I'm under pressure this morning from these two. I'm having a real challenge. But that's it for the first hour. And I do apologise for Barry's word that he used there. I think he meant excrement going into the sea as opposed to the word he said. That's it for the first hour. We'll be back after the news and we'll see you then.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning and welcome back to The Political Correction. Coming up on the show, we're talking about the Labour Party after a poll showed they have their biggest lead over the Conservatives for a decade. We're joined by the Master, Alistair Stewart, to discuss Friday's hustings in Manchester, and that plus plenty more after the latest news with Tatiana.
Good morning, it is 11 o'clock. I'm Tatiana Sanchez in the GB newsroom. For the first time in 3 decades, dock workers at Britain's busiest port have gone on strike in a dispute over pay. Nearly 2,000 union members at Felixstowe in Suffolk are walking out for 8 days. The port handles nearly half of all container freight that travels into Britain. Union workers recently rejected a 7% pay offer from their companies because they say it's too far below the rate of inflation. Well, Head of Corporate Affairs at the Port of Felixstowe, Paul Davies, says the strikes will prove costly for workers.
Unite, though, have declined. They've refused to put the offer we've made to their members, their 1,900 members. They've had no say in this, and now they're having to go on strike. And that's going to cost each of them, the thick end of sort of £900 each in lost wages.
Barristers are voting on plans for an all-out strike next month in a row with the government over jobs and pay. Members of the Criminal Bar Association have already been walking out on alternate weeks in England and in Wales. They're now deciding on whether to take uninterrupted industrial action that would start on the 5th of September. The ballot closes at midnight today, with the result expected tomorrow. Conservative leadership hopeful Liz Truss says she believes there's too much talk that there's going to be a recession. In an interview with The Sun on Sunday, the Foreign Secretary insists that an economic slump is not inevitable, despite warnings from the Bank of England. The central bank cautions the UK could face the largest recession since the 2008 financial crisis due to the rising energy prices. If she becomes Prime Minister, Ms Truss plans to introduce immediate tax cuts, which she believes will spur growth of the economy. She's also promising a small business and self-employed revolution. Scotland Yard is being investigated by the police watchdog after it emerged officers came into contact with student nurse Owami Davies after she was reported missing. The Met says they were called to an address in Croydon on July the 6th due to concerns over a woman's welfare, but she told them she didn't want help and they left. The interaction occurred before Essex police handed the missing person case over to the Met on July 23rd. Ukrainian boxer Alexander Usyk has retained his heavyweight titles over Anthony Joshua in their rematch last night. The Brit was beaten on points in a split decision by judges. Following the loss, Joshua reacted angrily by tossing two of Usyk's belts out of the ring before shaking his hand and addressing the crowd with an emotional speech. Joshua later praised the Ukrainian.
I've got to give the man his credit because he's done well. It takes a lot to come up in weight, challenge, win the belt, defend the belt. He's good. He's really, really good. He's been doing it since a young age, had hundreds of amateur fights. He's a real deal. So well done to him. I'm happy for him.
This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now let's get back to the political correction.
Good morning, you're watching and listening to GB News. This is the political correction and we're here for the next hour to correct politics and put you the people back in charge. Coming up this hour, we'll be talking about the Labour Party following the news that they hold their biggest poll lead over the Conservatives for almost a decade. We'll also be joined by Alistair Stewart after his heroic hustings in Manchester with the leadership hopefuls. And if you want to get involved in the conversation and have your email read out on air, then email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is the political correction. First, though, let's return to the Tory leadership race, and I'm delighted to be joined by Conservative MP for Croydon South, Chris Philp. Chris, tell us why you're backing Liz Truss in this leadership race.
Good morning. I'm backing Liz because she's got a positive, optimistic vision for growth in our economy. And if we can grow our economy, people are going to earn more money. And of course, it'll ultimately generate more income to fund public services like the health and education service. And Liz understands that the way you get the economy growing is to make sure the tax burden is as low as it can be, not in 5 years' time, but today, and that the regulatory burden on businesses are as low as they possibly can be. And if we pursue that vision, lower taxes, lower regulation, we will generate economic growth that will benefit the whole country. And it's that optimistic, energetic, pro-growth vision that has drawn me to support Liz's campaign.
And Chris, we've been talking about the NHS here in the programme this morning and what we could do to try and deal with those horrific waiting lists. What would you hope Liz would do to fix the NHS?
Well, I think one of the really interesting ideas I've seen her talking about today, in fact, I think in the Sunday Telegraph, is the idea of changing some of those rules, rather complicated pension rules, which are actually incentivising senior hospital doctors, consultants, as well as GPs to retire, to leave the NHS, often in their 50s, at a time when we need their services. I think there are innovative ideas like that to retain more people in the NHS that will, I think, help us get these backlogs down. I think the new health secretary, whoever that is going to need to look at this issue with a sense of national mission to make sure these waiting times are reduced. Obviously, COVID had a massive, devastating effect on the operations that were done outside of COVID. It's created a huge backlog. I think that's the case in many countries around the world. We now need to make sure we're doing 110% to get those backlogs reduced. It should be a real area of focus, and that idea about keeping experienced GPs and consultants by changing those pension rules is a really good idea.
Yeah, Chris, and we're going to move on after we finish speaking to you to talk about that poll that's out about Labour holding their biggest ever lead over the Conservatives for almost a decade. We've had a summer of the Tory leadership campaign. How are the party going to unite after this race? Because at times, I'm sure we'll agree, it's been a bit spiky between the different sides of the party. How are you going to unite after this is all over?
Well, I think you're right to say that it has been a very robust debate. There have at times been disagreements, and that's, I think, actually quite a healthy thing. If you're having a proper contest and you're debating ideas, you are going to have differences of opinion, and we've seen those. And I think what is important is that when this is over in about 2 weeks' time, the whole party, I think, will unite together behind whoever wins this contest and becomes not just leader, but also Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I think we'll unite behind that person, pull together, and do what we're supposed to do, which is deliver for the people of the entire United Kingdom. And I think whatever people's views are in this contest, I think they will come together and do that in early September.
And just to go back to that, Labour having the biggest poll lead over the Conservatives in a decade, what do you think is the plan to deal with that? Because that surely must be concerning for the party.
Well, look, I'd make 2 points. Firstly, and the public like political parties to be united. And obviously, because we're having a leadership contest in public, by definition, as you said a second ago quite rightly, we are having our debates and sometimes disagreements in public, and the public can see that. And that perhaps is why the polls look as they do. But as soon as we have a leader elected and a Prime Minister in place, with the party, I know the party will unite around that person, and that issue will therefore, by definition, get sorted out in a couple of weeks' time. I think the second point, of course, is that what really matters is the general election, and what the people, the public will judge us on in that election is our record of delivery. And I think Liz Truss, if she's elected, will deliver for the people of this country, and her low tax, high growth agenda is one of the important components of that. And come the next election, when people see that being delivered and see that working, I think that will be, give them a reason to re-elect a Conservative government. So I'm, for those two reasons, relatively sanguine about that poll.
OK, Chris, thank you so much for joining us from Westminster this morning to talk about the Tory leadership campaign. But now we're going to talk about Labour and the news that they have the biggest poll lead over the Conservatives for almost a decade, with a YouGov poll showing they have the backing of 43% of voters, 15 points ahead of the Conservatives on 28%. The poll also shows solid support for Keir Starmer's policies in addressing the cost of living crisis, following the announcement that he wanted to freeze the energy price cap at current levels. Asked which of Starmer, Sunak and Truss had the best plan for dealing with energy bills, 25% chose Starmer, with 11% choosing Sunak and only 8% choosing Truss. Barry, that must make for great reading.
It's not enough.
Fair enough.
Look, Arlene, in politics, particularly when you're in opposition, you should never gloat.
No.
And you shouldn't gloat over poll figures. What I am most heartened by is that the public, when asked about policy, put Labour's policy first. And to me, it's always about that. It's about the policies. And it was interesting that Chris Philp, in that clip that you did with him, he said, well, look, at the moment, what the public are seeing is a disunited Conservative Party. And therefore, policies aren't breaking through. It's not about policies, it's about the disunity. Actually, it's interesting, when actually specifically asked about the policies, Liz Truss's policy got 8%, favour, whereas Keir Starmer's policy was way out in front. So I think politicians should always focus on policies. It's not about personality, it's about policy, and that's why I believe that the Labour Party at the next election must have the policies that ordinary people in this country believe are making sense for them. Policies about education, policies about training and apprenticeships, policies about employment rights. I mean, here we have, a summer of solidarity, as I would call it, with we've had Felixstowe, we've had talk about the barristers, we've talked about, teachers and NHS workers all going on strike. But people are beginning to realise that actually this is about them. It's not about somebody else inconveniencing them. It's about them. It's about their wage levels not being enough. And I think it's really important that the next Labour manifesto has very front and centre policies about employment rights that people can see, that makes a difference to me. That actually works for me. That guarantees me the sort of future where I know that my children are going to be well taken care of. I know I'm going to be able to pay my mortgage. I know I'm going to be able to feed my kids. And actually, they're policies about climate change and the environment that I know give my kids a future. You look at this summer, one of the big things that we haven't talked about in this summer, on this today, is about the drought, is about all the climate change that's going on and the environmental issues. And actually, a lot of people now will look to the Labour Party and say, yep, like they did at previous elections. I think Friends of the Earth said Labour had the best environmental policies, even over the Green Party. So those are going to be the things that I think, when it comes to it, are really important. So let's ignore the persona. Is it Liz? Is it Rishi? Is it Keir? It's not about that. It's about the policies. And we've got to make sure, as a political party, we don't say, oh, gosh, we're ahead in the polls, we can just coast to a victory at the general election. No. We have to get the policies that actually give people in this country a vision of the future that resonates with them.
And of course, the energy cap policy, Paul, is very understandable. It's very simple to understand. And I would argue that's why people are attracted to it, because they understand what's been talked about. I mean, what did you make of the poll?
Neil Kinnock always said that general elections are not won in weeks, they're won in years. And I think that's as true today as it was then, that actually if you are a major political party aiming to win a general election, then you have to have had, I think, consistent poll leads, good, solid poll leads, for at least a couple of years going into a general election. So I think Barry's right, actually, that we shouldn't get carried away with one particular poll carried out at one particular...
Although there's a trend, and there has been a trend over the past 6 months.
Although there's a trend, but I would argue there's nothing like enough there, nothing substantially enough to suggest that Labour is in any way odds on to win the next election. And I still think, actually, that with a large part of the electorate, probably the key part of the electorate for Labour, the people in the Red Wall constituencies who went Tory last time, the people whose hearts and minds Labour needs to win back if it's ever going to have a chance of winning power again, I sense that the party is still some distance from sealing the deal with those communities, those constituencies. I think a Brexit legacy still exists in those constituencies. I think we saw that in the local election results earlier this year. I think there was a fundamental breach of trust between the Labour Party and, Red Wallers, let's call them, people who live in post-industrial England, provincial England, working-class towns of England, and people who felt very betrayed, actually, that they voted. We could debate Brexit, the merits of it, until the cows come home, but the way that people in those constituency saw it is often I'd voted Labour all of my life, I voted in the referendum to leave, and then my party decided that my vote wasn't acceptable and they told me I had to go back and do it again. I think it's impossible to overestimate the extent of damage that was caused in the relationship between red wall constituencies and the Labour Party as a result of that policy. I think there's other things. I think, you know, the Labour Party arguably over the years, as I've argued before, has become a much more kind of middle-class party rooted in our fashionable cities and university towns, and has for too long neglected its core vote in the north, in the Midlands, in its traditional heartland.
Industrial base.
And frankly, until the Labour Party gets that message, and not just Keir Starmer, I think Keir Starmer gets it to a degree, but until the party at large, including its foot soldiers and its activists and the constituency Labour parties and the MPs and the councillors, understand that message and understand that they can't just talk to themselves all the time in their own little echo chambers. They have to reach out to people who were once loyal followers of the party, but now in many respects hate the party and will take a lot of winning back. Until they understand that at large within the party, then, you know, this particular poll is going to count for nothing in the end.
Yeah. OK, well, we're going to stick with a Labour character. This week, the Tony Blair Institute published a paper titled 3 Months to Save the NHS, in which it warned that the health service is on the brink of disaster. The Institute has called on the government to extend the COVID-19 and flu vaccination strategies, not just to over 50s this autumn, but to everyone over the age of 18. It also called for mandatory mask wearing. Paul, what have you got to say about Tony Blair's Institute and what their paper says about the NHS?
I mean, the truth is, I think whenever Tony Blair speaks now, I don't think it particularly resonates, rightly or wrongly. Occasionally has some good to say. But I think his stock is so damaged within the Labour movement and beyond, frankly, because of what happened with Iraq mainly, that I think very few people now take what he says particularly seriously or attach much weight to it. I think most people respond with, is Tony Blair getting involved in politics again? Shouldn't we have seen the back of him? And I think that's a price that he's going to pay probably for the rest of his life, really, whenever he wants to intervene in politics. And as I say, in some respects, that's a sad thing because he was Prime Minister for 10 years. You can't be Prime Minister for that long without...
And not have an impact.
And not have an impact, and not have something useful to say about it sometimes, and not say some constructive things sometimes. I mean, on this latest intervention, I think he's largely wrong on this, not necessarily the bit about saving the NHS. Of course, you know, that's an important issue that needs to be addressed. I think the call for mandatory masks is wrong. I mean, I have to say, I don't think there has ever been any compelling evidence in favour of masks. You only have to go back to the beginning of the lockdown when all of the government's advisors and medical people were saying, actually, we're not recommending masks because we don't think they do much good. And there has never, frankly, been any kind of study that has produced compelling evidence to the contrary, which has justified that sudden change in approach. And in fact, we discussed on the show some months ago, there was a study carried out by government on the effect of masks in schools and whether or not they had any positive benefit, and it showed that actually there was no tangible positive benefit to any serious degree. So I think the argument that we should go back to that society where we all cover our faces again when we're going out into shops and when we meet in public, the sort of thing that denies those everyday human interactions that are the lifeblood of society and so important to all of us, when arguably it's not going to do tangibly much good, I think would be a completely wrong move. I would hate to see it coming again.
And briefly, Barry, what did you make of the report?
Look, the first thing is I think flu this winter is a really serious problem. I urge everyone to get their flu vaccination who's eligible for it. I think that's really important. The second thing I would say is I think the headline 3 months to save the NHS is absolutely right. The NHS is in crisis. It's in crisis because of underfunding. It's in crisis because of the supply chain issues that the supply side issues that we talked about earlier. But it's also in crisis because of the legislation. And what the legislation in the Health and Care Bill has done is it has put in place a structure now where private companies are controlling both the commissioning of care and the provision of care. And private companies, as you know, Arlene, have a legal obligation in this country to maximise benefit for their shareholders. And therefore, you cannot be impartial as a commissioner. You are constantly going to be thinking, if I commission this service, how are my shareholders going to benefit from at the other end? And I think this is a fundamental opening up of our health service to the sort of Americanization. And, you know, a recent report in the US found that 25% of the population in America delayed going to a doctor or receiving treatment because they could not afford it. Now we have Liz Truss saying that she thinks it would be a good idea to charge people for visits to the doctor. What does that do? It means that people who are vulnerable and disadvantaged and poor will actually delay treatment. And what does that do? It costs the health service more, but it makes more profit for the private companies. It's absolutely wrong, and it's right.
Well,
we have 3 months to save it.
And it's about free at the point of delivery, and I think that must remain the case. But coming up after the break, we'll be joined by our very own broadcasting legend, Alistair Stewart, so don't go anywhere.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GBNews.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain every Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m. A news hour that comes with a trigger warning. Scorching hot opinion with prominent guests saying the unsayable and a little bit of weekend fun thrown in. Unlike other broadcasters, I won't be forgetting what the B in our name stands for. So howie in for Real Britain Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
Well, we're going to speak to Alistair in a few moments, but just before we do, we want to get some of your views across. So, Barry, have you got some new views?
I have. Jeff says it's OK government wanting more females and ethnic groups to join the military, police or fire service and creating targets. But do the above groups want to join? Has that been thought of? Absolutely, Jeff. That's why we need to get the faces front and centre out there to attract them in.
Yeah, and Janice says something similar. She says the RAF has always recruited women and ethnic minorities. The main thing is they don't want to join the RAF. Yeah. So that's a familiar thread that's come in there. Paul, what have you got?
Yeah, quite a few on the RAF, actually. It's provoked a debate. Tessa says, I just want to say that the RAF, as with all military recruitment, is done through various assessments. They are not cherry-picking. My daughter is 5 foot tall and is in the RAF police. There's no discrimination on recruitment for women. Barry should be wary of making such comments. Be wary, Barry. Everyone has a choice of career. We should not be toying with the country's defence to tick boxes.
There we go. Well, Alistair, you had an exciting time over the weekend.
Did
you enjoy it? Did you enjoy Manchester?
I did, yeah. I thought Manchester, I thought it went genuinely well. And intriguingly, Tom Harwood, our friend and colleague, was talking to Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 committee, who said to Tom that initially he was worried that this contest would drag on and on and on. And social media reflects that to a degree. Get on with it. We know who's going to win, they say. But Graham made the point that actually hundreds of people turned up for that Manchester hustings. There are several more still to go. And that there are something like 40 or 50 MPs in the Conservative Party yet to declare for either candidate. And we think maybe between 15 and 20% of ordinary members of the Conservative Party yet to decide who to vote for. So I think there is all to play for. And we've invited Bob Neal and Michelle Donnellan onto the programme at the end, one from the Truss camp and one from the Sunak camp, really to assess the state of play. And I think the big question there as well is how they put the party back together again. Yeah. But before that, our big topic today, my first big job in television was an industrial correspondent in the late 70s and early 80s. Winter of discontent.
When we had industry.
Hey?
When we had industry.
Well, you could argue when you had trade unions as well, well led by charismatic intellectual giants like Hughie Scanlon and Jack Jones and Mick McGahey.
Terrible twins.
Yeah, but they ruled the roost. And we've invited Charles Ray, who GB News viewers will know as a former court correspondent on The Sun. But Charles and I were in that little group of people that included Richard Littlejohn, who were the industrial correspondents of the 1980s, just to see whether it is a rerun of those times, the degree to which organised Labour can really take on a government in power, even one with a majority, how your party deals with it, with Sir Keir saying, you can't go on the picket line, and people ignoring that and turning up.
Hasn't stopped me, I have to say.
Well, nor many other folk as well. So we're going to reflect on that. And at the heart of it, of course, is this sort of thing, we're going to screw you over until you give us what you want, which is never popular with the public and never popular with whichever party is in government. So I think it should be quite an interesting discussion about that.
And, it's interesting you talk about industry, but, of course, we used to talk about trade and industry, and now we talk about trade and investment and enterprise. We don't really talk about industry anymore. And that was your point, Paul, earlier on in the programme when you were talking about production, wasn't it?
I think it's a major debate. How do we re-industrialise? How do we bring back some of the good, solid, blue-collar industries and jobs that we've lost? What are the reasons why we've lost them?
But do you put data, high-tech, artificial intelligence in that box?
Oh, absolutely.
Because, I think that's what's happening. I agree with all of you that the idea that 60% of the UK economy is now based upon finance in the city is not a good thing, because we all know about economic cycles, and it can be good and it can be bad. But if you look at places like in Scotland, the Central Rift Valley or the Thames Corridor, there are amazing companies that did not exist 30, 40 years ago that are not only creating huge wealth for their shareholders, but also employing a lot of people, very bright young men and women. So it's shifting as well.
That's absolutely right. I mean, if you look at Belfast as the centre of cyber security, for example, all of those new jobs are being created.
Yes.
I think it's important that we talk about that.
And the other thing which is evolutionary as well is in the old days, the first big strike I covered was the steel workers, which was a kind of dummy dry run for Thatcher and her government before the miners. But those are smokestack industries, the old type of industries that you're talking about there.
But they're also national security industries.
Yes, that's true.
If you don't control your steel, you don't control your defence.
I agree with that.
If you don't control your energy,
if you don't control your ports, Felixstowe today, and if you disrupt the railways, it's not just people not being able to go and see their football team play yesterday. It's about goods that arrive in this country getting to end users, be it supermarkets or industry. And it's stuff that we make to flog abroad that can't get to the ports, and the ports are disrupted anyway. So in that sense, the trade unions do know what they're doing.
I think there's always a balancing act when you're... I mean, I've been involved in leading strikes. It's a balancing act between, on the one hand, trying to exert enough pressure on the boss to make sure you get a good deal, and at the same time not trying to alienate the public, not trying to disrupt the service so much that it causes such inconvenience across the country. The alternative, of course, is just to sit and do nothing, and that really isn't an alternative.
And the point is this, that actually unions and workers are not actually trying to bring companies down. Unions want companies to be successful so that they can pay their workers a decent wage. And actually, the strikes are a last resort, not a first strike against management. They're an absolute last resort because workers are saying, and you've seen the ballot figures, 97% of workers voting for strike action.
But not being allowed to vote on what is held by the management side to be a decent offer in the railways.
Well, because they've taken a decision at the beginning about what they consider about the cost of living, if actually that decent offer, as you call it, is 7% over 2 years, and inflation's predicted to be 13%.
Well, that's back to the prediction of inflation again.
Exactly.
It is. It's back
then
to that
what happens is you're actually taking a 7% cut. So it's
you could
not
give them
that
13% then and cut back on the jobs by about 15%.
Oh dear, I think this is going to go on and on.
Or the profits, or the profits,
we're
or
gonna
the management bonuses.
We're going to have to hold this.
Someone phone ACAS.
I thought this was supposed to be conciliatory.
Charlie Ray and I used to stand outside ACAS for hours and hours and hours.
I want to know, were the stories about the old Labour Correspondence Club in the 70s and 80s, were they all true?
Paul Embry, will you stop? Because you know we have to go to the news.
I'm afraid they were.
And Alistair Stewart's going to stop as well. And we're going to hear from Alistair on his show at 12. Coming up then, it's time for our regular Common Ground section with Father Nadim Nasser. But before that, here are the headlines.
Good morning, it is 11:32. I'm Tatiana Sanchez in the GB newsroom. For the first time in 3 decades, dock workers at Britain's busiest port have gone on strike in a dispute over pay. Nearly 2,000 union members at Felixstowe in Suffolk are walking out for 8 days. The port handles nearly half of all container freight that travels into Britain. Barristers are voting on plans for an all-out strike next month in a row with the government over jobs and pay. Members of the Criminal Bar Association have already been walking out on alternate weeks in England and Wales. They're now deciding on whether to take uninterrupted industrial action that would start on the 5th of September. The police watchdog is considering whether to investigate Scotland Yard after it emerged officers came into contact with student nurse Owami Davies after she was reported missing. The Met says they were called to an address in Croydon on July the 6th due to concerns over a woman's welfare, but she told them she didn't want help and they left. The interaction occurred before Essex police handed the missing person case over to the Met on July the 23rd. Ukrainian boxer Alexander Usyk has retained his heavyweight titles over Anthony Joshua in their rematch last night. The Brit was beaten on points in a split decision by judges. Following the loss, Joshua reacted angrily by tossing 2 of Usyk's belt out of the ring before shaking his hand and addressing the crowd with an emotional speech. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the political correction.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. Well, you may not agree totally with everything on this show, but in our regular feature, Common Ground, we discuss the issues and social ideas that bring our country together. For today's Common Ground, we're joined by Father Nadim Nasser. Father, it's good to see you in your beautiful church.
Good to see you.
I think today you wanted to start off with, of course, the cost of living crisis.
Yes, I think the government is making us feel like beggars. We beg for the energy companies to have mercy on us and help us a little bit, as like sitting at the bottom of their, at the feet of their tables and hoping to get the crumbs falling from their tables. This is unacceptable. Their profit is incredibly multiplying while we have to beg for help from them. And this is really, the people are talking everywhere about that. The energy cost is rocketing and the people are unable to cope with that. And another thing I want to highlight, why do politicians have short-sighted agenda or program, and all that they can think of is how to be re-elected? I think a lot of politicians, and for different generations, they gave us strategies with short-term and only to be re-elected. And not many politicians we have that they have the long-sighted agenda, long-sighted strategy, so that they look what is good for the country. I think they are looking only what is good for them to be re-elected. Because of that, we have such a huge crisis at the moment. We are involved with wars, we are involved with bad politics, we are involved with problems that nobody takes responsibility for, and we are in chaos at the moment.
And Father, I think you've hit on a very key issue, and of course energy is one of those areas where you cannot just look at election cycles. You have to look at 20, 30, 40 years ahead and not just look at the next election. But interestingly, you were back in Syria recently. Tell us about that.
Yes, I was in Syria recently, and I came back, and it was heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. The country is divided. The country has no electricity, also no fuel. The prices are rocketing every day. And what is so heartbreaking is the abuse of children in Syria. I saw in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Homs, in Latakia, in the big cities of Syria, a systematic abuse of children and using those children for begging in the streets. Instead of being in the schools, they are in the streets begging with systematic mafia-like style or gang style to use or abuse those children. And of course, we still have worldwide the problem of refugees. We have more than 80 million of refugees around the world. And we ask ourselves, why are we in crisis? Why the economy of the world is so down? Why are we heading into recession? I tell you something. I'm not a politician. I'm a priest. But I can say our economy around the world is based on war instead of building our economy on peace, on building up our international relations in a fair way. So all what we are concerned with is to sell arms, to push that war ahead, or play cards here in this war country. As a director of the Awareness Foundation, we work with young people and children in war zones, and I know exactly what I'm talking about. I am on the ground with the grassroots people, and I know that politicians are abusing, selling arms and selling weapons on a high level in order to rejuvenate our economy. But we can rejuvenate our economy other than supporting wars. And in fact, we can lift up our economy by looking at our industry, looking at our agriculture, looking at our international treaties, instead of lighting fires all over the world.
Yeah. And Father, those are huge questions, and they're huge issues. So where is faith in all of this? What is the role of faith in what you have described as a very difficult time?
As people of faith, my dear, we live by hope. So many people, they say to me, Father, are you optimistic for the future? I don't believe in optimism or pessimism. I believe in hope. I believe that the church should be more outspoken, more saying what it should be said. I think we as people of faith, if we speak in any issue, we are accused in a way that we are interfering in politics. Sorry, politics is ruling us as people. So if you want to rule me, I should have a say. So stop saying to the church, you don't interfere in politics. We have to say what we think about economy. We have to say what we think about selling arms, about wars and international relations. It is our right as citizens. People of faith should not be marginalized. And the church should not shut up only because we should not interfere in politics. Sorry, the government is ruling us, is putting the programs for our lives. We are paying taxes to the government. So we have the right to say what we think. And because of that, I say the role of faith is to be a prophetic voice in the society. And the role of faith is to say a word of truth, even if the politicians don't like it. But we will say it, and I will say it from this church and everywhere. I am a priest, but I'm outspoken. If the church doesn't like it, tough. If the government doesn't like it, even more tough. Sorry, I'm passionate
Father,
because I believe we have something to say.
Father, I think we've got the message very clearly today, and I thank you for giving that message, and it's important to have faith in the public square. That's my opinion to you, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us today. So now it's time to look at the biggest stories from the world of sport, and of course we're delighted, as usual, to be joined in the studio by broadcaster and writer Aidan McGee. Well, Aidan, tell us about last night.
Yeah, I haven't spoken about football barely at all this morning, but I mean, it's been overshadowed completely by this fight last night, and it was a gripping, it was an absorbing encounter. It ebbed and flowed. Joshua literally had Usyk on the ropes at times. I always felt Usyk was slightly out of range.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I did. I mean, this is a world-class operator. Listen, Joshua's a world-class operator too, but he was just slightly outclassed last night, as he was back in September at Tottenham when they fought the first time. This is the second time they'd fought, of course. Life changed, of course, for Usyk in that time since his country went to war. He fought in the front line as well. So getting into last night, yeah, it went the distance. It wasn't a split decision. That was hugely controversial that Glenn Feldman, one of the judges, awarded the fight to Joshua. I mean, I just don't know how he could have done that. And that's not any slight on Joshua. He performed well. He was brave. He took risks. He was trim. He was actually 4 pounds heavier than he was back in September. But he zipped around the room better. Sorry, the ring. He occupied the centre of the room as well. The ring. It's their version of a room, I suppose, isn't it? It is a room, yeah, exactly. It's still a space. And so he occupied it. He took the fight to him. But as I say, Usyk always out of reach. And then we had the shenanigans afterwards where he left the ring. He took umbrage, Joshua, to something that Usyk's team had said to him, we think. A degree of frustration, I think, because I always felt that Usyk was just that one step ahead of him. And he probably realised that maybe that was his last chance to really establish himself in the company of greats. And so he stormed out of the ring, then he came back, he was talked back in, he took the belts and dropped them out of the ring, which was a bit disrespectful. He then took the microphone at a time when that was Usyk's time. You know, he'd been through so much in a year and he was speaking, and Joshua then goes on this explosive-laden rant talking about... He actually made a couple of good points. He said that, you know, I'm not like Fury. I didn't start fighting when I was 5. It was not in my blood. Same as Usyk. I didn't start fighting when I was 5. I was 18, and I'm 18 stone, and I can't move the way that these guys do. I've done really well to get here, and I deserve more respect than I've been given. I could kind of understand what he was saying. There was a theory as well last night that he was actually suffering some consciousness issues. But having said that, he was within an hour of the fight. He was talking quite lucidly, if a little emotionally.
I mean, the emotion must be.
Yes, he was. That was right. He cried. He cried in the press conference. So I did have a degree of sympathy for him. I don't personally think that's the end of him as a fighter. I think if he'd not done that thing at the end, I think he would have retained a bit more dignity among his supporters and everything and everybody else. But I think there's still some fights left out there for him. I think Deontay Wilder's almost in the same position as Joshua. He's had a few knocks in the last couple of years. Popularity waned a little bit, but I think that fight could be made. I think commercially as well. Tyson Fury, a fight against Fury, irrespective of what happens between Fury and Usyk now, a fight between Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury would be difficult to resist.
Is Fury likely to fight Usyk now? Is that on the cards?
Yeah, he's come out of retirement this morning, actually. Yeah, he's
Fury,
I know.
Come back from Frank Sinatra.
Exactly. Yeah, he was. I mean, I've fallen for it so many times. So many times that I was at Sky and I'll get a call. Oh, Tyson's retired. Oh, you better get on the phone to the agents, find out what his plans are. And then by the time I made the call, by the time it starts ringing, he's back out of retirement again. So he's. But they're both. I think they're both about 33. Joshua certainly is. It's actually quite young for a heavyweight these days. You know, I mean, it's been 30 years since people like George Foreman went into their 40s and were still not getting knocked down. So there are still fights out there. It's not always about the weight of the belt either. It's just about whether they're going to sell tickets. Yeah. And that's why we're getting a situation now. We're getting catch weights where they're going, right, OK, you fight that way, you're good. It'd be great to see you fight. Can you meet someone in the middle with your weight? It can be quite dangerous because you're getting fighters who, I mean, you see next, I think it's October the 8th, Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. are going to fight in a rerun of the old family feud of their fathers, and it's known as a catch weight. So that means that they've got to reach a certain weight, which doesn't actually exist in terms of, you know, it's not welterweight, it's not cruiserweight, it's not bantamweight, it's not middleweight, but it's just, right, you've got to meet at 157 pounds. Now, what that means, it sounds quite simple, they can make the weight, but what it means is that you're getting fighters who are not fighting at their natural weight, so they're lacking power in some
And is that just
cases.
Purely for commercial reasons?
Oh, yeah,
You've got to hit that weight because we want you in the ring because we want to make loads of money.
Yeah, I mean, it can be dangerous because you're seeing, as I say, fighters not fighting at their natural weight It means that they can lack power. They can maybe not have a judge when they're carrying extra weight. They don't know the extent of the power that there's in their fist. You know, they don't. It's a dangerous weapon. They don't move as well. So you get a different fighter. You're not necessarily seeing it the best, but it's the risk they take. They're the ones taking the check. Nobody's died yet.
Why is the governing body of the sport not actually saying, sorry, as you've just done, sorry, this is dangerous, it shouldn't be happening?
No, that's. I think we've long passed that stage, to be honest with you.
Well, look, we want to move on to a story before the end, Aidan, but just mention Manchester United, Liverpool playing tomorrow night.
They're playing tomorrow evening. I don't know if you remember 2 years ago, that fixture was scheduled at Old Trafford. 200 fans, United fans, broke in to protest against the Glazers.
The Glazers.
Now, we're back. The Glazers, the protests are back on the agenda. Jurgen Klopp, the Liverpool manager, has made this point. Said, look, last time the game got replayed. Tomorrow, we have an idea what's going to happen. If it gets postponed this time, we get the points. We prepared for the game. We travel to Old Trafford. If you can't control your fans, then we get the points. It's quite controversial, but some people would say he's got a point.
Yeah, he has a point. Anyway, stay with us, Aidan, when we discuss this last story that we wanted to cover, and it is around a story which we covered quite a bit when it happened, and that's around the P&O Ferries. And we've learnt this week that the P&O Ferries company will not face criminal proceedings over its mass sacking of almost 800 workers earlier this year. It has emerged that has come out this week, and it's, of course, sparking calls for a change in the law. The company provoked public anger and was hauled in front of MPs to answer questions when it sacked hundreds of workers without notice in March. Barry, Paul, this is a huge story, and it's something that we covered at the time, as I've said, but no criminal prosecution.
The chief executive of P&O Ferries went before a select committee and said, yes, I know we were breaking the law, I knew it at the time, and I would do so again.
Yeah.
We have a fit and proper person test to be a director of a company in this country. Why is he still in place? That is ridiculous. You have to ask yourself, if our employment law is not sufficient to tackle such an incredible breach of the law, of industrial relations, and yet at the moment the government, whilst being soft on the employer, is ratcheting up the scale on the employee and on unions. And just before Parliament went into recess in that final week, they put through 2 new pieces of legislation which, even if a union made a technical error in its numbers for strike action, a technical error which made no difference to the outcome of a ballot, they could be fined £1 million. Another piece of legislation that went through to make the whole basis of a strike useless, because strikes are unfortunately supposed to try and inconvenience the management and inconvenience people, because that's the way a worker says, look, the only option I've got is to withdraw my labour. And yet what the legislation did was it said you can put agency workers in there to cover for those who are on strike. How are you going to do that for train drivers or safety operatives or anybody else? But that's what the government is doing. It's tightening it up on the worker whilst letting the management off free and easy.
And Paul, this was the criminal prosecution, but the civil case, as we understand it, still continues.
Remains ongoing. But it's a really disappointing decision because what we saw, Barry's absolutely right, what we saw is gangster capitalism, effectively. We saw a company that just treated hundreds of workers like dirt by saying, you're not worth anything to us anymore, we're going to bring in cheaper agency workers. A company, by the way, whose parent company, DP World, has just announced record profits, multi-million-pound profits, and it shows how employment law in this country is not as tight as it was, as it should be, if companies can get away with this sort of thing with impunity, as they appear to be doing. So I think we need an employment bill. We need an employment bill going through Parliament that outlaws practices like this, and in the same way that trade unions are held to account and sanctioned and punished if they dare put a foot wrong, we need employers held to the same level of accountability.
Yeah. Well, we'll be watching with interest what happens on this civil case, but it has been a case that a lot of our viewers got very anxious about. The fact that you can just sack 800 people over Zoom, come to MPs, say, yes, I did break the law, and then nothing appears to happen. It is quite incredible that that has been allowed to go ahead. Sorry, Aidan.
So did British Airways do something similar? Someone before last?
British Airways used the fire and rehire tactic, yes, indeed, and British Gas. Lots of companies, in fact, with P&O, of course, it wasn't fire and rehire. It was just fire and replace.
Yeah.
But the government had the opportunity.
Yeah, done to you.
Yeah. The government had the opportunity to actually legislate against this. It was a private member's bill, in fact, that I introduced into Parliament last year, and it would have stopped. It would have stopped P&O in its tracks, even though they were only fire and replace. It would have stopped them doing that because it would have put in place injunctions and unlimited fines on the company if they broke the legislation that said you had to negotiate, you had to be open and transparent about the reasons for any restructuring. And that's what P&O did not do. The government had the opportunity to legislate against it. They failed to do so. And actually, Paul's absolutely right. We need an employment bill, an employment law in this country that gives workers decent rights and makes sure that, yes, they have to be accountable in any strike action that they take, but so do the employers. And at the moment, it's a green light to the employers to do whatever they like.
How rich of the government to condemn what P&O did in terms of bringing in agency workers and then legislate to allow agency workers to break strike?
I also think it was the inhumanity of all of that at a time when you can just get rid of people like that over Zoom. Anyway, that's the end of the show. I want to thank Barry and Paul for their company today. We've had a spiky show today. I hope you've enjoyed it. You've been watching and listening to The Political Correction. Join us next Sunday at 10 a.m. for 2 hours of discussion, debate and analysis of the week's biggest political stories. Next, though, it's Alistair Stewart.
So looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking dry for many, although there will be some rain showers around. Let's take a look at the detail. After a bright morning, skies will turn increasingly cloudy across the southwest this lunchtime. There'll be some patchy rain around, especially across Cornwall. Feeling humid, though, despite the cloud.
Well, apart from the odd shower, much of southeastern England will be dry again as we move into lunchtime. Some spells of sunshine then breaking out.
Wales, on the other hand, will be rather cloudy and grey with some outbreaks of rain, especially in the south of the country.
And on to the Midlands. The top of the Midlands there, seeing some rain showers throughout the afternoon, but then much of the south of the Midlands dry. Also some spells of sunshine breaking out. Temperatures around 21 Celsius there later.
And the best of the sunshine this lunchtime will be across northern England, although the odd light shower can't be ruled out across the Pennines. It will feel pleasant in the sunshine, with temperatures approaching the 20s.
Winds lighter across Scotland yesterday, and a mix of sunny spells and scattered showers there, especially in the north and the west.
And it'll also be a better day for Northern Ireland, with much of the country dry with some spells of sunshine, just the odd shower along the north coast.
Into this evening, cloud and rain for the southwest, spreading northeastwards, but much of the north remaining dry, and that's how the weather's going to shape up for the rest of this Sunday.
Join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain every Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m. A news hour that comes with a trigger warning. Scorching hot opinion with prominent guests saying the unsayable, and a little bit of weekend fun thrown in. Unlike other broadcasters, I won't be forgetting what the B in our name stands for. So Howie in for Real Britain Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m.